Mystery surrounds us. Life is stranger than we dare to hope. Life is stranger than we'll ever know.
Many of us have read and know about the striking similarities between Kennedy and Lincoln. Some say these are overblown half-truths, but others say these are no strange coincidences. Do things happen for a reason, or do we as humans have the ability to find connections that mean absolutely nothing in everyday life if we look hard enough? Here are some cases. I'll let you be the judge. Actor Anthony Hopkins was happy to hear that he landed a leading role in a film based on a book by George Pfeiffer. A few days after signing the contract, Hopkins traveled to London to buy a copy of the book. He tried several bookshops, but there wasn't one to be had. Waiting for his train home, he noticed a book apparently discarded on a bench. Incredibly, it was the book he searched for. That in itself would have been a coincidence enough, but in fact it was merely the beginning of an extraordinary chain of events. 2 years later, in the middle of filming in Vienna, Hopkins was visited by George Pfeiffer, the author. Pfeiffer mentioned that he did not have a copy of his own book. He had lent the last one containing his own annotations to a friend who lost it somewhere in London. With mounting astonishment, Hopkins handed Pfeiffer the book he had found. "Is this the one?" he asked, with a note scribbled in the margins. It was the same book. Henry Zieglin thought he had dodged fate in 1883. He broke off a relationship with his girlfriend who out of distress committed suicide. The girl's brother was so enraged that he hunted down Zieglin and shot him. The brother, believing he had killed Zieglin, turned the gun to himself and took his own life. But Zieglin had not been killed. The bullet, in fact, had only grazed his face and then lodged into a tree. Zieglin surely thought himself a lucky man. Some years later, however, Zieglin decided to cut down that large tree which still had the bullet in it. The task seemed so hard that he decided to blow it up with a few sticks of dynamite. The explosion propelled the bullet into Zieglin's head, killing him. The shortest chapter of the Bible is Psalm 117, and the longest chapter is Psalm 119. Now, by coincidence, Psalm 118 is the middle chapter of the entire Bible, between the shortest and the longest. This means that there are 594 chapters before and 594 chapters after. If you add 594 and 594, you'll get a total of 1,118. This is where it gets interesting because Psalm 118 verse 8 happens to be the middle of the Bible. And this is what the verse reads: "It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man." In other words, God is at the center of the Bible. 10-year-old Laura Buxton wrote on a label her address with the message, "Please return to Laura Buxton," and released it on a balloon to fly off into the sky. 10 days had passed and a farmer pulled the balloon out of a hedge that separated his field from his neighbor's house. He noticed the name of Laura Buxton. This was the name of his neighbor's daughter. He handed over the balloon straight away, thinking it must have belonged to her. But this was a different Laura Buxton. Though she was also 10 years old, she lived 140 miles away from the girl who had released the balloon. The girls decided to meet. The girls, both tall, were the same height, and both decided to wear pink sweaters and jeans for their first meeting. Their hair was brown, and they both wore it the same way. Both girls had 3-year-old black Labrador retrievers and gray pet rabbits. They also had guinea pigs, which were the same color and even had the same orange markings on their hindquarters. Morgan Robertson in 1898 wrote Futility. It described a maiden voyage of a transatlantic luxury liner named the Titan. Although it was touted as being unsinkable, it strikes an iceberg and sinks with much loss of life. In 1912, the Titanic, a transatlantic luxury liner, widely touted as being unsinkable, strikes an iceberg and sinks with great loss of life. While on a business trip in the 1950s, Mr. George D. Bryson stopped and registered at the Brown Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky. After signing in at the register and being given his key to room 307, he stopped to see if he had any mail. Indeed, there was a letter. The mail girl handed him an envelope addressed to Mr. George D. Bryson, room 307. This wouldn't be so odd except for the letter was not for him, but for room 307's just previous occupant, another man named George D. Bryson. In 1975, while riding a moped in Bermuda, a man was accidentally struck and killed by a taxi. 1 year later, this man's brother was killed in the very same way. In fact, he was riding the very same moped. And to stretch the odds even further, he was struck by the very same taxi driver driving the very same passenger. In the 1920s, 3 Englishmen were traveling separately by train through Peru. At the time of their introduction, there were only 3 of them in the entire railroad car. Their introductions were more surprising than they could have imagined. One man's last name was Bingham, the second man's last name was Powell, the third man's name was Bingham Powell. None were related in any way. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a book about 4 survivors of a shipwreck who were in an open boat for many days before they decided to kill and eat the cabin boy whose name was Richard Parker. Some years later, in 1884, a boat was found with only 4 survivors, who were stranded for many days. Eventually, the 3 senior members of the crew killed and ate the cabin boy, whose name was Richard Parker. When Norman Mailer began his novel Barbary Shore, there was no plan to have a Russian spy as a character. As he worked on it, he introduced a Russian spy in the US as a minor character. As the work progressed, the spy became the dominant character in the novel. After the novel was completed, the US Immigration Service arrested a man who lived just 1 floor above him in the same apartment building. He was Colonel Rudolf Abel, alleged to be the top Russian spy working at the US at the time. 2 weeks ago, I wrote a story about a clown named Frank Belmont. The story was false and only meant for entertainment, or was it? 2 days later, I was sent the newspaper clipping from John Tenney. These are only a handful of tales. There are millions that happen every day. Is this a world of pure chance? Or underneath the surface, is this world held together by a spider web of intersecting and crossing lines? If we figure out the riddle, can we alter the future or control destiny? If you happen to look at the clock at the same time every day, or see a person that could almost be your twin, you may find that life is stranger than we'll ever know.